So you were talking before about writing Cunning Folk during the global pandemic. So I'm wondering, what was that specifically like in terms of both the process, how it might have differed, and in terms of whether it affected your writing being in that bizarre situation?
The main it was an advantage was the lack of disruption and distraction. Um, I really felt that book I was able to write in a concentrated fashion every single day, and I never really lost the I guess the voice I was writing it in. Voice probably not the right word. The style I was writing it in. I was able to just jump back in every morning. Often a day, because I've worked from home since 2009. There are, relentless ringing of the doorbells, people coming and going, and um, no, 2020 was. I seemed to get such an enormous amount done. I seemed to regain time in that year. Um, so my own activities were curtailed as well. I wasn't kayaking as much. We'd take the family walk or what have you, but I just seemed to get so much time, so much more time to write. And had that continuity and that momentum day after day, which I don't always get when I'm writing a book. Um, and I was more or less, I think I got to the end of that year and I put 300 miles on the clock of my car, and that was almost all driving to various places in Devon to put my sea kayaks in the water. I walked more, and I definitely paddled further than I drove in that year. Because on a Saturday we'll paddle up to 30 kilometers plus, and maybe up to 16 on a Tuesday night. So yeah, I was in this, I guess, almost like a 20-mile radius for a year. Um, so when I was out of the house, I was on the sea, or I was walking, or I was in a natural environment. And if anyone's familiar with the book, it's very much a book about the natural world. Um, so I think I had a kind of more of an affinity with the landscape and the natural world, and was able to write about it more easily, to write that kind of book. Same with the reddening. I mean, that so much of that came from my walks, walking the southwest coast path for a few years, and I took lots of photographs and made lots of notes. So they were two books really that came out of, um, I guess, being in nature, and then being cloistered away in my office, writing about it. So it was a terrible time in many ways, obviously for a lot of people. But I did find those 2 years, 2020, 2021, two of my most productive ever. Um,
And I feel as it is a folk horror book, as it is set in a rural environment, it is almost the perfect book given your situation, given your own location, given the unique period of time that COVID was, in which almost like nature, I was going to say took over, but reclaimed is perhaps a better
oh yeah,
way of kind of considering it. So, I mean,
it
I'm
had a
I'm
real
wondering,
resurgence.
did you know that was this the book that you always planned on writing, next at the time, or was it something that almost came out of being in that situation, and you're like, "Wait a minute, I have to write this folk horror, this horror that's concerned with the natural elements."
Well, it was. I wrote it as a screenplay first in 2019. Um, it's a screenplay that's still in development. Um, but so I had the story and I had the characters, and it really was the story of a family that just did not get on with their neighbors. So the it was a kind of block horror with limited locations and a limited cast, which I was advised to write. Um, so it was about these two warring households. I think the the kind of emphasis on the natural world and its connection to folklore and cunning magic and so forth, that was definitely enhanced or embellished by the resurgence of nature and being confined to 20 square miles of coastline for the best part of a year. But I wrote the screenplay in 2019, and it was picked up almost immediately. But I thought the chances of this ever being made was the same with The Vessel, and the same with All the Fiends of Hell. Those were my three original screenplays. The chances of them being made, adapted into films, are so remote. It's really difficult to get a film made. It really, really is difficult. I salute anyone that gets a film made. That I thought I really become attached to the characters and to the stories, and I am primarily a novelist. So I thought I want to adapt all three of my original screenplays into novels. So I knew in 2019 I was going to adapt Cunning Folk into a novel in 2020, and the pandemic was just coincidental. And then I wrote The Vessel in 21, in a slightly experimental fashion, in that I removed all interior from the characters. And then All the Fiends was a screenplay I wrote in 2020 and developed it with the film management people I have at Gotham, who've represented me for years. And I just asked them, I'd like to have a go at writing a big studio film. I've written two sort of screenplays for British indie films. Can I work on this with you guys? And they were fabulous. Their sort of experience they could bring from working in Hollywood. And so All the Fiends of Hell was my attempt in a screenplay at a big studio film. And I'd started a novella about an alien invasion in 2018, supposed to be a novella in between rewriting drafts of The Reddening, but it dragged on to 60,000 words, and a very slow 60,000 words, that I hit pause on it and thought I'll return to this sometime in the future. And then when I wrote my collection of short stories, Weed and Other Derelictions, in 2019, those were the short stories without any characters in them. An idea that I'd wanted to try for years. I'd written one story, and I wrote another five. And the final story in that collection, or wrote another six, was this alien invasion idea again. So there'd been the unfinished novella, the short story, and then I tried it as a screenplay. And then finally in 2022 and 2023, I turned it into a novel. So that story took 5 years to become a book. It's been a screenplay, an unfinished novella, and a short story without characters in it. So yeah, it's sometimes it's things happen in a roundabout fashion. That's just what it takes. Cunning Folk and The Vessel were far more straightforward. But Cunning Folk was very, very different to my original screen. It was the original screenplay, my first draft I turned into the novel. And once I started writing the novel, I never thought of the screenplay. It just became its own creation. Whereas with the vessel, I deliberately tried to close the gap between page and screen. I wanted the story to feel more like a film. Hence, the whole story is told more or less through action, dialogue, and description without any interior from the characters. Um, Whereas All the Fiends is back to being, I guess, a more traditionally written novel. I try and do something different with every book.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I know that we've spoke a little bit before about screenwriting, but I mean, you said that these days, I mean, the chances of, a screenplay being made into a film is pretty remote. So that begs the question, why, as primarily a novelist, why are you continuing to write these screenplays? Are you writing it more as a palate cleanser between books? Are you doing it so that you've now almost got this blueprint, this plan that will inform the novel? Because you seem to have now created this pattern where you write the screenplay, then you adapt the screenplay into a novel. Are there financial considerations? Is there anyone paying you to write these screenplays? And then finally, a lot of questions here, but finally, how long does it take you to write each screenplay? What investment of time are we looking at?
Well, that is a lot of questions. I'll try and remember the first one. For me, it was because I love film, and I tend to imagine most of my books as films. Certainly, The Ritual and No One Gets Out Alive. I imagine them both as films I wanted to see, and actually wrote the sequel to each and include it within the novel, which is why those two books come in two parts. They were my imaginary films and imaginary sequels to the first films. So I'd always had that abiding interest in horror films, and it was when the ritual was made, and I was kept in the loop, and I had a set visit, and I looked at the generations of screenplays, and although I was just the author of the book, it really did, trigger an interest in me, and I thought this is something I've got to have a go at. So I started reading about screenplays and reading screenplays, and I thought 2018 it was. I'd finished the Reddening at the end of 2017. I'd spent just over a year in it, and I wasn't happy with it. So I spent another year rewriting it. And at the same time as rewriting it, I thought I'm going to write my first screenplay, which was The Vessel. Which wasn't the most ambitious. I kept things simple, baby steps. And then I tried another one. Imaginarium, who made The Ritual. I showed it to them, and they said, if it's crap, we'll tell you. And they liked it, and they said, we'll develop it with you. That was The Vessel. And then I wrote Cunning Folk, and that went through the same route. And then I wrote All the Fiends. So I wrote three, one a year for 3 years, and wasn't going to let those stories and characters just die as screenplays in development hell. I wanted them to have some kind of life. And when you write a screenplay, you know, you think about everything from the inside out. So I had three complete stories. Why would I not turn them into novels? But that was a kind of chapter I've stopped now. I haven't written a screenplay since 2021. I've written three. Two of them one's in hiatus. One is still in a very active development. that came very close to getting the trigger last year. The third one, the big studio film, they looked at it, and I had so many interesting meetings with interesting people, and they liked the writing and they liked the set pieces, but they weren't keen on the enigma. But I made some really good connections through it. But it's not. I seriously doubt it's going to become a film in in the form that I've chosen. So that was a kind of a period, 2018 to 21, when I was writing screenplays, and then 20 to 23 when I was turning them into novels. But that's a chapter I'm kind of closing now. I've written three. I've adapted three screenplays into novels. I don't have any plans to write an original screenplay again from scratch speculatively. That's writing them on your own without a production company, or because traditionally, screenwriters, I consider myself a novelist, a dilettante with screenplays, but a screenwriter will write an outline or a treatment, and then that's commissioned for them to develop it into a full screenplay, and then so on and so forth. It goes through different drafts as directors come in, and that they want to put their stamp on it, and you'll get a director's draft and so on and so forth. But it usually starts with a log line, outline, treatment, and then it becomes a screenplay. I made particularly hard work of it for myself because I wanted to learn how to write a screenplay. I was doing it for my own benefit more than anything else. Here was the year 2018. I had an opportunity. I'm going to be rewriting a novel, but I'll write my first screenplay, and I'll study screenplay writing because I love film, and I'd seen one happen with the ritual all through the development to the shoot. In future, I would follow the traditional path. Is I would write an outline and possibly, turn it into a short story, and then try and interest someone with that. I wouldn't write an entire screenplay start to finish speculatively and go out with a finished screenplay. One of the problems with doing that is no matter how attached you are to your story, once producers look at it and directors and so forth, it will have to change again and again. My record on one of them is 15 drafts, 15 versions over 5.5 years. I'm just trying to think of one of your other questions. Maybe you can prompt me.
I mean, one of the questions was simply, how long does it typically take to write a screenplay? I mean, baked into that, I suppose, is the number of drafts, which is going to vary, as you say, from project to project.
I found with all of them. See, I would do a lot of research, and then I would write a treatment. One thing I found in the film industry is a lot of people don't read. So I kind of did it the old school way. Is I would write a treatment, almost 40 to 60 pages. So I knew everything about the characters and the scenes and so forth. And that took quite a long time. And then I wrote an outline in which I divided everything up into scenes and acts to try and get all the arcs in place. So by the time I'd finished that process, that preliminary process with the research, the treatment, and the outline, the actual screenplays the first drafts took about 6 weeks. All together, I probably worked on them for 5 or 6 months. Whereas a lot of, I think, modern screenwriters, the treatments are only a couple of pages because, film executives and so forth aren't going to read 60-page outlines. Apparently, back in the time of the silver screen, and onwards, the 40s and the 50s, the treatments used to be over 200 pages long. So everything has gotten shorter and shorter and more concise and brief. So I was kind of in the middle. But I think I'm really pleased with the three novels, and I think kind of structurally they're three of my strongest books, particularly Cunning Folk. You know, I like and dislike all of my books equally, but I think the two I'm most pleased with from a writerly point of view, in terms of the story, the structure, that there's nothing I would change. Oddly, it's Cunning Folk and Lost Girl. Um, and it is a really good discipline learning how to write screenplays, because I think it made me a much better storyteller. Because most of my books prior to that, I would do lots of reading around the subject, and scenes would start to suggest themselves to me, and I would write a few scenes and the whole story would grow out of that. The story would just sort of come out of the act of writing the first few scenes. Whereas with the last three books, I saw where to enter and where to finish. I had everything thought through, everything, every scene, every eventuality, every reaction of every character to everything that happened, and so on and so forth. And to have that complete vision for a story. And the development processes are quite brutal as well, because people will question every single creative decision you've made. Every single line can get micromanaged, and people will have an issue with this and that, which surprises me why so many films that actually appear are so poor. Because having been through the development process, I'm just like, well, nothing escapes anyone. Everything is scrutinized and micromanaged from the inside out, and yet I see so much kind of sloppy storytelling in film and TV, where I think the action is just not credible, and the reactions of the characters in the stories are just not credible. And it's as if you've just been poorly prepared as a viewer to accept everything you're watching. You have to turn off any kind of discriminatory facility you have to accept it. So there is a dislocation there between so much of what I watch and the development processes I've been through and I've watched occurring, where I've had a kind of executive producer role. But it definitely made me just trying to write screenplays and reading about them, and going through the development process. It made me a much tighter storyteller, and I think more critical of my stories and plots. And I think it's resulting in the book that I started in January now. I can see how that experience of writing screenplays and development is being brought into play in this novel, in that I'm writing mini treatments for each scene before I write the scene in the first draft. So, I spent an enormous amount of time writing and rewriting screenplays, but it's helping me as a novelist too. So the time wasn't wasted. And, you know, I've written three original novels that have come out of that process that started as screenplays. Was there anything else in your question? I have.
Well, I mean, I feel that very little time is wasted because there are always creative lessons to learn, or there are sometimes just answers. Bob and we wrote a screenplay a few years back. We adapted They're Watching, and then I've written another screenplay based on one of my short stories called What Would Wesley Do? I'm now actually adapting the screenplay into a novel. So it's been a bizarre one where I went from short story to screenplay to novel. But, even if it's just telling us whether we do or don't want to actively write screenplays. I mean, when interviewing people on their deathbed, and I don't know who is this person who goes around interviewing people when they're dying, but it's said that people, they don't really regret the things that they do. They regret what they didn't do, what they don't have answers to. But I do find that, like yourself, I mean, even if I'm not going to pursue screenwriting. And I mean, there's kind of a question mark over that anyway, but it helps you shape or plan future stories and novels. It helps with a framework. I think it gives you a deeper appreciation of storytelling as a craft.
It
And
makes you a better storyteller, definitely,
yeah,
and it brings in brevity and an economy that you might not have had before. It makes you think harder, I think, about all the decisions you make. Whereas, when you're writing a novel, it can be quite, um, it can be an experience where you're almost not aware enough, you're not conscious enough of how much you're writing, um, and then you come to rewrite it, and it seems almost impossible. You know it's not working. You know it's not right. You know it needs an enormous amount of editing. And eventually you get there to the version that's acceptable to you. But, you know, well, I talk from my own experience. I often think, why did I not think the first draft through a bit better? But I will do now because of that experience, um, writing screenplays. Um, I mean, I'd be writing up to, my record was 14 drafts of one novel. Usually it's around seven. I'd quite like to get it down to about five. Um, but did you find that with writing the screenplay and then writing prose, that the benefits?
oh, there's definitely immeasurable benefits. And I mean, sometimes people talk about writer's block, but if you've got the screenplay, or you've even taken a kind of screenplay approach, it will be very difficult to have a sort of writer's block because the
Mm,
pieces are there. Now you're still going to have creative problems and things that you're going to have to deal with. This isn't some magic solution where everything is now easy, but I think there'll always be a step to take. So I
mm.
think it would be almost impossible to find yourself blocked and incapable of writing anything further because you've got the pieces there.
And yeah, and it is a different discipline because 110 pages, most of it's white space, and you're telling a story in pictures. You can't resort to the inner lives of characters, um, which was very strange for me to start with, but I actually really started to enjoy it. I really enjoy writing them. I just wish it was much easier to get them made into films.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I mean,
yeah.
the second part of it is, I think, is far more difficult, which is if you get something into development, then it's a collaborative effort, and
Right.
you do have to accept that you don't have creative control, and quite often you're asked to change things, and you're just adamant that that's wrong, that's the detriment to the story, and then you're thinking, well, we're at odds here. We're trying to tell different kinds of stories, and all kinds of other variables are brought into it in terms of, what will get financed, and what would be more acceptable to sales agents and distributors and so forth. So, but once you accept that, you learn the hard way that this is now a collaborative effort, and these things are incredibly expensive to make. And no one is going to be an auteur that writes and directs and has it all their own way. So the second half of it, I think, is more difficult. But writing the treatments and writing the screenplays, I would just get so absorbed. But you can get to, if you write the entire screenplay, a speculative screenplay, you can get too attached
Mhm.
because you can see it. So I could imagine mine so vividly as films, and I'd put lots of intricate symbolism in them, and that would pop later on in the story. And um, the people that read them were very kind. They did say, they're really good to read your screenplays, but then you get the but.
Mhm.
The one thing I heard over and over again in meetings was, I was writing quite esoteric. They would call them A24 films, which are the films that I love,
Yeah.
and if I could make horror films, it would be in the A24 style. But I was involved with people wanting to make different kinds of films.
Mhm.
Um, but no, a fabulous experience, and I've learned so much, and I'm very grateful, very lucky to get that kind of knowledge and expertise from people with so much experience in the film industry, because I didn't have any. You know, I've learned a great deal, but I think I've learned, not to spend 6 months writing a speculative screenplay again. The next time I go in, and I've been asked for things from film companies, I'll I'll write a treatment, and an outline.
Yeah, and I wonder, with your experience on No One Gets Out Alive, I mean, what were the specifics of what you did in that role? Equally, what were some of the limitations and the things that you could not do?
I would be the first person to say my role was a minor role. I was more, I guess, as the author of the book, more of a consultant or a second pair of eyes. So I had a vote, but I didn't have a final decision on anything. I was part of the team that was developing the screenplay. But, the producers would have the final say on everything, and the director. But could be useful as a second pair of eyes, reading the successive generations of screenplays. And that was quite a tricky one. No One Gets Out Alive, because, as you know, the novel's set in Birmingham, and the first screenplay was written by a British screenwriter, John Croker, and set in Birmingham. And for various reasons, it was changed to the US. So it instead of being a novel about a British girl in the gig economy in another town that wasn't her hometown, I mean, in very compromised circumstances, it was about a migrant from Mexico in America without the right documentation, but with the same screenwriter. So, although it was quite an inspired decision to move it to another country, and there were parallels between situations for the character in each country, with a screenplay, that was a real challenge. So yeah, there were a lot of drafts and a lot of conversations and so forth. So it was more, I guess, more of a consultancy role in that. Um, but going forward, I'd like more of a role, to be a screenwriter, particularly with the adaptations of my books if I'm involved. Now that I have some experience as a screenwriter, I'd like to be involved in the writing more.
And so now going forward, when you're selling the film adaptation rights, would involvement be a deal breaker for you if somebody wanted to buy the rights, but they don't want you involved in the process? Is that a non-starter, or is that something you would consider for having it out in the world as a film? I mean, I suppose there are both creative and financial decisions to
Well,
consider.
it wouldn't be a deal breaker, but I'd definitely throw my hat in the ring.
Mm.
Um, so on the three screenplays that were in a form of development, I was the screenwriter. Um, if someone takes an option on your book, it's their decision who they have as a screenwriter. I mean, there would be reservations about me because a lot of people don't like novelists adapting their own books for obvious reasons. And also, I don't have much experience. I'm not a seasoned screenwriter or showrunner. I've written three off my own bat. Um, so yeah, it's a good question. I'd definitely throw my hat in the ring. And at least now I have something to demonstrate. Well, this is my style. Um,
And at the moment, are there any books that look like they may be making their way to the screen? Or I suppose
I've
what
got
we go on.
yeah. I mean, Cunning Folk is in a good place. With me as a screenwriter, that's been quite a long development. Various things have happened that I won't talk about, um, but that's still going. Um, it's had peaks, it's had troughs, it's had peaks, but it's still it's still in the fight. And then there's a few of my novels, well, in fact, all of them, other than House of Small Shadows, are under some form of option, and some of them are being more actively developed. Whether it will result in him getting the trigger eventually, I don't know. But I think I have six that are in some form of development. One of my own screenplays and five of the novels where I'm not the screenwriter because this was, these deals were done sometime before. So who knows? Two have been made, and another five came really close. In fact, one we were only a few months away from starting the shoot, but that's how it goes. You know, I'm 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 grateful. I'm fortunate to even be in the mix, even be considered for it. Um,
Yeah, I feel after the writer's strike as well, there's so much uncertainty right now. I mean, talking to other people in the industry, talking to my film manager, I mean, it seemed like a great result for the writers, or at least a not disastrous result. But now we're in this uncertain period, particularly because, these big studios, they always win in the end. So we're seeing a number of
Yeah,
projects that are cancelled. And I mean, even if the writers win money in some way, the studio always wins. So we're in this very tumultuous and uncertain time.
I think that's right, and I wouldn't rule out more industrial action. And also, I mean, the enormous impact that streamers have had on the industry. I mean, the sheer amount that's been in production and so forth. But all of the streamers, are they sustainable business models? And for how much longer will they be? How many of them are turning a profit? So I do think there'll be more flux and change ahead.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think unless it's a really huge kind of streaming platform, like, the biggest, like Amazon, like Netflix, then it's difficult to know how much longevity they'll have, just like publishers. I mean, they come and go. We kind of alluded to that off the air,
Yeah.
the kind of changes that we've seen within the horror landscape in the last decade or so. I mean, there's not so many, kind of like we were talking about websites and podcasts. There are very few that were about when we started, talking, when we had that interview in Notting Hill in 2011. There aren't many of us left. There are a lot of writers even that have come and gone in that time.
Yeah. Yeah. There's half as many bricks and mortar bookshops now.
Yeah.
Um, but you have, Amazon KDP, and there's been the explosion of the indie sector and the rise and rise and rise of Ingram and Amazon. It's constantly changing. And then the other big game changer, of course, is going to be technology,
Yeah.
the impact of AI, which
Yeah.
we're all speculating and fearing and so forth, or anticipating. So yeah, it's just constant change.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
And
despite it all, I think if you, as an author, as a publisher, if you follow your own kind of best practice and you aim for quality control, that that will never be obsolete.
yeah.
From your
Yeah, and we said,
storytelling to your writing, all the way through to the publishing,
mm,
I think that's probably more important than ever to maintain those standards now and to aspire to and to strive to get as close to excellence as you can.
yeah, we said before about how Rich or Limited came about when the mainstream was not just going away from horror, but almost trying to cloak actual horror titles in other genres. If we fast forward to now, I mean, how do you think the attitude from the mainstream to horror is? How do you feel that the horror scene has shifted, both in terms of mainstream and independent publishing?
Yeah, I will admit that I don't pay as much attention to it as I used to. I mean, when I was working in publishing for 11 years, I was uh, I was aware of everything that was coming out, everything that was happening. But since I embarked on this on the indie route in 2016, I pay less attention to it and more attention really just to my own press and my own readership. But in my peripheral vision, it does appear to be having another bout of popularity with traditional publishing. I mean, it never, to my eye, ever seems to go completely out of vogue in America. The UK blows hot and cold on it more often, um, but I do see, Titan publish a lot of horror in the UK now and in the US, and then there are writers like Paul Tremblay and Grady Hendrix and Josh Malaman who appear to, they have the confidence of Joe Hill, big publishers, and they publish regularly. Um, and then quite a few authors have been translated into English, like Mariana Enriquez at Granta. I think she had a new book coming out later this year. I read all of hers. Um, I think that the kind of distinction between traditional publishing and some of the smaller mid-sized publishers and the bigger indie publishers, I don't think there's such a distinction between them now, at least not amongst readers. I mean, what I have noticed is how much the horror community has grown, particularly in social media, Facebook and Instagram. And there doesn't seem to be any interest really in terms of publisher loyalty from where the books are coming from, or not as much. Obviously, the the hardback collector presses that's different, but I'll often see a title, the cover of a title, and lots of positive reviews and lots of talk and engagement with a particular title. And I'll look at it and I think, I've never heard of that publisher. But it seems to have such widespread mainstream interest from probably even a micro press. So, if I look at a book and think that's an interesting cover, there's a lot of chatter about it, it might be from HarperCollins or it might be from a micro press. It's more of a level playing field now, I think, because the market has moved online and onto Amazon. The old monopoly where traditional publishers really, with I guess the chains, controlled everything that was on the shelves of bookshops and everything that was available. That's that's been and gone now. What I have noticed is there's just so much of everything in every genre, because the book production is so much easier. The route to market, as they say, is available to everyone. So discovery hell continues to worsen year by year. I don't envy anyone starting now. I mean, you guys would be aware of that. You'd have more of an awareness than me of the horror field as it stands, and what's been published and what's been popular and the trends, because you're watching it all the time and constantly interviewing writers. I mean, I'm interested in what your take is on horror, say the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, I mean,
boomed.
I think you're right that there's less of a monopoly from the big traditional publishers. I think readers and consumers of horror, they're just interested in well written original, thought-provoking stories. It doesn't really matter who published the book. I think the story concept, the idea, the writer is far more important. And if you get a favorite writer, then you're going to follow them to whatever publisher
Mm,
or indie publisher that they go for. And more and more people, they're going a hybrid route anyway.
mm,
I mean, if we look at Gemma Amor, who started off as indie publishing, she's now got some traditional books as well. We've seen people go the other way, like Chuck Wendig, who was more kind of indie to begin with and now has the traditional books. Of course, we've seen with both you and David Moody, going from these big houses to almost exclusively independent publishing.
mm.
And I think that, yeah, what people want is they want a well-told story. The advantage, of course, that the big presses have is having all that money behind them, and then the potential to really market and advertise the story if they so choose. And that
Well,
is a massive caveat, because a lot
yeah.
of times, I've spoken to people that they have put things out with a small press, they have put it out with the biggest presses that exist, and it was the small press who did more with the marketing. The big publisher, they put the book out and then they didn't really do anything with it.
Well, I mean, that it's very true. The difference between the front list and the mid list is a huge distinction. I was a mid list writer, and up to, I don't know, 2013, 14, the mid list was still a reasonable place to be. I mean, there'll always be that publishing, you know, people should jump at it if they get the opportunity to get on the front list, and a big publisher can get 50 to 100,000 copies of your book in a nationwide supermarket chain with a national rail advertising campaign, etc., which, it tends to be thrillers, the crime and thriller, and sometimes epic fantasy that gets that kind of belief and push from traditional publishers. Although obviously the first two books would have to meet their sales expectations for that to continue, but the mid list really did change. You know, um, there was very little or no marketing or publicity spend. Um, Often the authors had to do so much of it. I mean, for most writers, that will still be preferable than going through the horrors of doing it yourself, which really is hard graft, and it's expensive.
Yeah.
You do have to invest in yourself, um, but front list publishing, fabulous if you get that opportunity. Mid list, for me, no, I would never go back on a mid list. Um, I would say being indie is infinitely preferable to that if you want a career and you want to produce a body of work, um, positioned and presented in the way that's satisfactory to you. Um, so yeah, it's in flux. I mean, that is the advantage of traditional publishing. If you get on the front list and you get the foreign rights deals and so on and so forth, um, but you don't know if that's going to happen. Um, I think most of the big publishers now are owned by these big media groups as well, and the remuneration is just shocking. It's and the higher the book discounts, the smaller the net receipts. So the trickle that goes to the writer, it's going from a trickle to droplets. Um, that's a consideration.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of people and indie publishers, they've been told that if they want to see their books in bookstores, then they need to give really a retail discount of a minimum of 55%. And I know that this is something that you've kind of fought back against with Ritual Limited. I believe that you've said you're only going to give 40%, and that's your kind of maximum.
Yeah, I kind of just acknowledged right at the beginning in 2016, what am I going to be giving up by going indie? What am I going to be giving up? And I was offered, I think it was 2 book deals for the Reddening and the plus one, which would have been Cunning Folk. So it was a massive decision to make. And I thought, I'll be giving up foreign rights. My books have always had good foreign rights translations, and I think across the 12 novels now, and even a couple of short stories, I'm up to about 50 foreign editions that are nearly all still in print. So I thought I'd be giving up that, and I'd be giving up bookshops. But the book trade was just in free fall. It was imploding. But actually, neither of those things happened. The Ritual Limited books are being foreign editions are coming out, or foreign rights are being bought more than the Pan Macmillan's the 8 Pan Macmillan titles. And also, the other thing I really disagree with is book discounting, the really high discounting, up to 80%. 65 to 80%. The prevailing rate is supposed to be 54%. That's the discount that bookshops buy books from publishers, 54%. But almost no one buys them at 54%. It's much higher. So I thought, well, because I'm going to set mine at 40%, going all the way back to the 90s, pre-net book agreement, that's rolled me out of the entire physical book trade. But it didn't. And it's slowly grown. And there's one title, I think, that's core stock now in Barnes and Noble. So obviously, I'm not selling tens of thousands to bookshops, or the amount that Pan Macmillan used to sell when I was having new titles coming out through Pan Macmillan. It's not on that scale, but libraries and bookshops do buy in stock a lot of the Ritual Limited books. I was down in London a couple of years ago, and I was working on a film, but I had an afternoon and an evening, and I went round all the bookshops in the West End, and I found, I think it was the Reddening in nearly all of them. And I was really surprised. I thought, well, I can see Ingram, who I've got 2 paperback distributors on print on demand. I can see every month that there are a certain number ordered, but I don't know where they're going. I don't know who's ordering them. Are they online retailers? Are they people walking into bookshops with an ISBN number? But no, it's actually bookshops ordering them every month. So, and the difference that makes as a business decision is enormous to the remuneration that comes back to the press and the author. Bob's rubbing his eyes. I've set him to sleep, I think.
No, I'm fine.
See, now I'm thinking I'm gonna just set all of my books to 40% and see what happens.
Try one. Try one.
It's probably a better idea, isn't it, rather than just set the lot. Yeah.
Well, I mean, with me, I guess there's a continuity from the 8 Pan Macmillan books. at one point there was a lot of them in WH Smith's and Waterstones, and usually one supermarket, usually Asda, used to stock my new books. So there's still that, you know, a new Adam Nevill title comes out, some of those retailers will stock the new book because they did well with the books on the backlist now, or some libraries will always get my new book. But I don't really know, you know. But
Yeah.
everybody advised you cannot restrict discounts below 55%, I think it was. Otherwise, no one will touch you. And I thought, well, I'm only interested in the online retailers now. But it didn't seem to make any difference. In fact, I put two. That's right. Because you always have to experiment. I put two at 55, and compared to the other books, the sales didn't change, except for one of them was less than all the books at 40 at 55. And I let it run for about a year.
Yeah, and this is the thing, independent publishing, we just have to carry out these experiments and kind of
Yeah.
see what does and doesn't work. But it's impossible, to be able to have a completely fair experiment because each book is different
Yep.
anyway.
There's always
But
variables to take into account.
yeah, yeah, and something that people might have noted is at the start of this conversation, you were talking about having 5 different versions of each book. Now, 2 of those versions are the mass market and the paperback. So there may be people thinking, okay, well, what is the justification for having 2 types of paperback? What are the advantages of each? And then, of course, why did you decide to go down that route?
Yeah, that I brought in on Cunning Folk. Well, there's a limited edition hardback, and then Ingram had always done my paperbacks, but in Cunning Folk, just as it was coming out, they had real problems. There was paper shortages. They didn't have every. They didn't have the freight drivers. Everyone was I think, other than Amazon, there was a massive shortage of long distance truck drivers, and there was sickness through COVID. So the pre-orders weren't being fulfilled. And when I ordered copies for my web store and sample copies, they took like 3 months to arrive on express delivery. So I just thought something's up here. And then you look on all the different forums, and lots of authors were saying the same thing. And they were all saying, because KDP has really improved from CreateSpace, I thought their paperbacks now are almost as good as Ingram's. Get your files changed and put them on Amazon as well. Because I noticed with my Amazon listings, all of the paperbacks were listed as titled temporarily unavailable. We don't know when. I thought, what? It's never been on. How can it be unavailable? They're printed by Ingram, and Amazon sell them. That's the way it's always worked for like the first 5 books. But suddenly I was getting this temporarily unavailable notice. And people were saying, oh, it's because Ingram's got this paper shortage, logistics problems, and so on and so forth in the pandemic. It's not there anymore. So I had my paperback files resized, and I put them on Amazon. And almost all the sales with paperback, until Ingram sorted itself out, were through Amazon. So other than the launch period of Cunning Folk, I corrected that. So I would recommend that if you do the indie route, you have your POD paperbacks on both KDP and Ingram with the same ISBN number. That's really important. The only thing really that's different is the barcode is in a different position on the back, and obviously the copyright page, if you acknowledge the printer, that would be different. So you need to cover both those bases. So it's one paperback edition, but through two distributors. And then there's a limited edition hardback, the ebook, the audiobook, and then I do a second hardback, one of these laminate hardbacks, which actually are really nice now. I didn't like them for a long time, the print-on-demand hardbacks, because I felt that the dust jackets were too loose, but actually the PLC hardbacks, they're really nice. So that becomes like the mass market hardback, I guess.
Yeah.
So altogether, in the life cycle of these books, there are 5 editions and 4 of them stay in print permanently. And you kind of have to have 5 editions because that's what readers want.
Mm.
You know, some people prefer audiobooks, some people prefer ebooks, some people prefer paperbacks, some people want hardbacks, but then once the 600 have gone, I'm endlessly getting emails saying, do you have any lying around? Do you know where I can get hold of one? So that's why we did the second hardback for people that missed out on the 600.
Yeah. And that
And
second one was that via Ingram, did you say? The
I do
second one?
it through both Ingram and Amazon
Yeah.
as well, the same as the paperback. And those hardbacks don't sell many through Amazon, I think because of the price point, but a lot
Mm.
through Ingram, and it's building every month. And I think it's libraries and bookshops buying them. But also through my web store, I've restocked. I think I only did them. They're only available last Halloween, and I think I've restocked them 4 times now in the web store. So it takes a while for people to become aware of them and so forth, but there was an interest in them. There was a demand for them, so it's something I'm glad I did.
Yeah. And if we look at Cunning Folk on Amazon, I mean, there's the option to buy the paperback, but there's only one option, so that would be the Amazon
Yeah.
printed one. If you wanted the Ingram printed one, presumably you go to a bookstore or another online retailer.
Well, that's up to the retailers where they take their stock from, where they buy their inventory from. I mean, as I don't want to point the finger because I don't know for sure, but you know, I have suspected there's a bit of a war going on between Amazon and Ingram over the print-on-demand paperback market, because what worked just like clockwork for years is Ingram were producing the paperbacks, and you know, Amazon were ordering them and keeping so much inventory and selling them and just reordering them. But then suddenly, title unavailable on Amazon, and the sales level drops on Ingram. But you make them available on Amazon, and actually, the level of sales didn't just restore itself; it became much bigger.
Yeah.
Because you know, if Amazon are producing the books, it makes sense for them to put their thumb on the scales a bit and make them more available
Mm.
than buying in paperbacks from third parties. This is me surmising how things work. So that's why I say you need to have the two, because if people are buying a paperback from Amazon Amazon will print it, but libraries and bookshops, they won't be buying their stock from Amazon, I think, on principle.
Yeah.
So that's where Ingram comes in, and Ingram covers more outlets as well. So the
Yeah.
two, if you use the two, you're covering all the bases, I think. And we won't get onto audiobooks because you and I have already discussed
Oh
this,
yeah.
Michael, and there is no well, the jury is still out on what to do with those.
Oh yeah. I mean, if we were to talk about audiobooks, we would need to dedicate another hour alone to audiobooks, and we still wouldn't get to the bottom of it. And
No, it's
given the time that it is in the UK, I don't think we can do that on this
actually, I hadn't
occasion.
noticed it's 1:20. For
It
someone
is.
who's usually asleep at 10 o'clock, I've done all right.
You're
I
doing
may have
okay.
been just talking gibberish,
It's
half
been very
asleep, but
it's been very useful.
Yeah.